thank you, Michael, for that warm welcome. What I would like to do today is go through my prepared remarks and then try to leave a little time at the end for questions. I think, have 3 questions that I owe answers on, 2 of them related to when people are getting their money, and then the other one on the very small, easy issue of when the U.S. will join the ICC. But this is a unique opportunity to be here today. It's a rare event when we have prosecutors from all of the tribunals in one place, and not to mention all of the other people that are here, particularly the Nuremberg prosecutors who are with us. I want to use this opportunity to talk about where U.S. policy stands at the closing days of one administration and as we prepare to transition to another. Obviously, at this point, we don't know who the next president will be and nor exactly what the next administration will look like. Nevertheless, on most aspects of international justice policies, there is a fairly broad bipartisan consensus. This narrowing of the gap between the political parties has taken place over time, and to a large extent because the views of the Bush administration have evolved over the last 8 years, but particularly during the second term. As I'm sure all of you are aware, this administration came into office in 2001, implacably opposed to the International Criminal Court, and frankly, quite suspicious of the whole concept of international justice. I'm sure there's some individuals still in the administration and some in Congress whose views have not changed at all since 2001. They continue to be wary of international tribunals. I would suggest, though, that this is not necessarily the prevailing view, and it is not reflected so much in day-to-day policy. That said, there are some differences of opinion within the U.S. government and between the U.S. and other governments. Sometimes those differences manifest themselves in strange ways, as we've seen recently in Security Council deliberations on Sudan, an issue I'll come back to later. But what I would like to do today is discuss how policy has evolved, and as I mentioned a moment ago, where it might be headed in the future. Finally, I want to touch on the broader issue of genocide prevention and response, a point raised this morning by Mark Drumble, and I think this will factor heavily in coming years. As all of you here know, this rebirth of international justice is a fairly recent phenomenon. The decision to set up the ICTY in 1993 marked the beginning of this era. At that time, very few people could have foreseen the growth and development of this field that has occurred over the last 15 years. At that time, I went out in the initial group of prosecutors from the U.S. Department of Justice to the ICTY. Before we left, the State Department assembled a number of the former Nuremberg prosecutors for us to meet with. At that time, they were the only people around who had had experience trying war crimes, almost 50 years before. It was a fascinating session sitting there. We spent an entire afternoon with a give and take, getting their advice, learning from what they had experienced at Nuremberg. But when I went to work at the ICTY in May 1994, I was the 7th person to join the office of the prosecutor, at a time when we were all sitting in one room, which was borrowed from a Dutch insurance company. I could not have imagined the growth of the ICTY, nor the fact that we would see the ICTR, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the International Criminal Court, the Cambodia Court, and others created in such a short period. I think very few could have imagined that we would see sitting heads of state indicted, but we've now seen Slobodan Milosevic, Charles Taylor, and Saddam Hussein brought to trial. Most recently, we've had a process initiated against Omar al-Bashir, and we may one day see him in The Hague. While I wouldn't go so far as to say that such trials are now routine, there is now an expectation that didn't exist 15 years ago, that even national leaders will be held accountable when they orchestrate and oversee large-scale atrocities. This is a huge change. As this change has come about over the last 15 years, the United States has played a significant role. Some here might say that the U.S. role has not always been a positive one, and I would be the first to concede that I've not always agreed with U.S. government positions over the last 15 years. I would argue, though, that on balance, the U.S. engagement has been much more positive and beneficial than it has been negative and detrimental. Going back to 1993, the United States was the strongest proponent for the creation of the ICTY and pushed hard for its establishment by the UN Security Council. Lawyers from the State Department, people like Michael, and Justice Department drafted most of the tribunal's statute. In an effort to jumpstart its operations, the U.S. seconded around 20 lawyers, investigators, and analysts to the court in 1994, of which, as I mentioned, I was one of the first to go. In the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda, the U.S. again played a pivotal role in the creation of the ICTR. Since that time, the U.S. has contributed around $500 million for the operation of these two institutions alone. The position I now hold, the Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues, was established in 1997 to ensure coordinated U.S. support for these courts. Since that time, my predecessors and I have done a tremendous amount of diplomatic outreach on behalf of the tribunals, engaging governments that are subject to the jurisdiction of the courts, urging them to cooperate, to arrest fugitives, and to provide evidence. Likewise, we've worked closely with allies to ensure that the international community remains unified in support of these tribunals. Also, we have from early on provided any assistance we could in the form of evidence or witness testimony that would aid the prosecutions or the defense cases. And since my office was first created in 1997, its role has expanded to cover the other courts established subsequently: the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the Extraordinary Chambers for Cambodia, the Bosnia State Court, the Iraq High Tribunal, and the International Criminal Court. The U.S. has actively promoted the establishment of these institutions and has provided political, diplomatic, and financial support to most of them, and to a number of domestic initiatives dealing with war crimes issues around the world. As I just indicated, though, U.S. political and financial support has not been universal. While we worked for many years to see the Cambodia court established, we have nevertheless had misgivings about corruption and other problems at that court. A concerted effort has been made over the last year to address those problems, and I'm confident that we will soon fund the KRT and get more directly involved in its support. Robert, I've answered one question. Okay. A more contentious issue has been the U.S. position on the ICC. Moving to question 2. While initially open to the proposal to create the ICC and an active participant in the negotiations on the Rome Treaty, the U.S. veered away from the court and from most of our allies on this issue, culminating in the unsigning of the Rome Treaty by the Bush administration. This position has at times overshadowed the very positive role the U.S. has played otherwise in international justice issues, as I laid out a moment ago. In relation to the ICC, though, the U.S. is not in the same place it was in 2001. Many of the concerns expressed about the ICC at that time and put forward by the Clinton administration during the Rome negotiations, and in fact when the Rome Treaty was signed, still remain. These cannot be easily overcome. That said, the openly hostile position taken toward the court in the first years of this administration has disappeared. The policy advocated by some at that time of not just non-participation, but active opposition to the court has faded away. Instead, you have seen since 2005 a shift toward more positive engagement with our allies regarding the court and with the court itself, achieving the modus vivendi promoted by Javier Solano. The rhetoric on all sides is much more constructive, less accusatory, but it goes beyond the tone of the language being used. This shift is translated into actions. The decision to allow the Darfur investigation to be referred by the UN Security Council to the ICC, support for the Charles Taylor trial at the ICC premises, the expressed willingness to share information with the ICC in the same way that we do with other tribunals, are indications of the changes that have taken place. Ultimately, all of this reflects the now accepted position that the ICC is the appropriate forum for certain cases, and in fact will be the only accountability mechanism available in some situations. I think there was some grudging acceptance of this fact when the U.S. abstained on the Security Council resolution referring the Darfur case to the ICC. The U.S. was not going to block the referral, but there was still not a full embrace of the court exercising its jurisdiction in the case. How far we have come since then was made evident by a recent vote in the UN Security Council on the renewal of the mandate for the UN peacekeeping mission in Darfur, UNAMID. In this vote on July 31st, the U.S. abstained because language was inserted in the resolution which we felt undermined the work of the ICC and the pursuit of accountability in Darfur. The resolution passed 14-0 with only the U.S. abstaining. In our explanation of vote statement, we made very clear that we were absolutely supportive of the UNAMID mission being extended, and that the sole reason we were abstaining was because, was because of the inclusion of language that was not supportive enough of the ICC's work. We also stated explicitly that Sudan had to fulfill its obligations and cooperate with the ICC. For those who have been attentive to past Security Council resolutions and the language that the U.S. has used in relation to the ICC generally, this is a significant change. I do not want to imply that all of the U.S. concerns about the ICC have been resolved. They have not. But I think the way this played out shows that the gap between the U.S. and our European allies on this issue has narrowed. And over the last few years, this has been the single most notable point of disagreement on international justice issues. We have generally been in lockstep on most other matters. So seeing us speak with the same voice, or in this case, with the U.S. being even more supportive of the ICC than our European partners, is a positive thing. We will continue to work closely with our allies on this issue. And in fact, I just returned from a meeting in London on Friday with the UK and France, our P3 partners, discussing this matter. The U.S. feels strongly that the prosecution should move forward, and at this time we've seen nothing that would justify an Article 16 deferral by the Security Council. My point in going through all of this is not to imply that every difference of opinion between the U.S. and every other government, or with all of the courts, has been resolved. There will always be differences of opinion. We see this every day among governments inside the European Union, not just with the U.S. We also see huge disagreements within the U.S. government. For those who think that it's one monolithic entity where everybody thinks the same, that's just not the case. I mean, that's not the case in anything that you experience in normal life, any group you're in. There's always a diversity of opinions. And I think you have seen an evolution of thought because of this diversity over time. But as we prepare to transition to a new administration in Washington, whoever wins, I don't think you're going to see stark policy changes from where we are now on international justice issues. There will obviously be some changes in emphasis and some shifts here and there, but my guess is that nothing will change drastically. Regions that are impacted by ongoing atrocities, places like Darfur, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, will continue to feature prominently, as will new crises that arise in places such as Georgia, Somalia, Burma, Zimbabwe, or Kenya, where there have been concerns over the last year regarding atrocities. One of the biggest challenges we will face over the next 2 or 3 years is ensuring that the ICTR and SCSL complete their work successfully. Both Hassan Jallow and Serge Brammertz mentioned this morning the issue of the residual and legacy matters at these courts. What happens to the functions that are now exercised by these institutions as they close? This has been a long-running discussion in the Security Council, and as this is the first time that the UN has shut down institutions like this, and the Special Court for Sierra Leone, although it's not directly under the Security Council's mandate, these are huge issues that we have to grapple with. One of the things that I think is going to be particularly problematic in relation to the ICTY and ICTR, where everything has to be managed through the UN Security Council, is the current political climate there. As I mentioned earlier, that the United States has been a huge financial and political contributor to all of these institutions, to the cost of around $100 million a year. We will continue to be very supportive, but the degree of political engagement necessary to allow these tribunals to operate smoothly is likely to increase. For the last 2 years, Russia has been insistent that the ICTY and ICTR complete their work in accordance with the schedule laid down previously by the Security Council, i.e. that trials be completed by the end of 2008, and appeals by the end of 2010. We have known for some time that there would be some slippage in these dates, and there's been a tacit understanding among Security Council members that some flexibility would be required. This is even more necessary now with the recent arrest of Radovan Karadzic, whose trial at the ICTY won't even start until the middle of next year. But getting Russian buy-in, which has been difficult but achievable up until now, may become nearly impossible as we look ahead into 2009, considering the heightened tensions between Russia, the U.S., and Europe. So much of what we do in relation to war crimes issues comes through the Security Council. It looks likely that even more effort will have to be focused on that arena and on alternative approaches when consensus cannot be achieved there. In a related matter to ICTR and ICTY completion goals, the next administration will almost certainly inherit the problem of fugitives, the individuals indicted by those courts who still remain at large. Again, Serge and Hassan spoke about this, so I won't go into great detail. But unless we get very lucky in the next 5 months and see a number of these people rounded up, this issue will stick around. In another matter related to completion, a point again raised by Serge and Hassan, is the need to develop domestic capacity in Rwanda and in the Balkans. We've been working intensively on this for the last few years, and this will continue in the years ahead. Finally, one last area that I think will be a priority for the next administration will be in enhancing U.S. capabilities and global cooperation in the area of genocide prevention and response. This obviously has resonance here since the focal point of this conference is genocide. So I want to spend the last few minutes talking about this issue. There's been a lot of discussion about genocide prevention and response over the last couple of years, and the U.S. Holocaust Museum has worked with a bipartisan group to undertake a study of how we can improve our approach to this issue. There's bipartisan support for this idea. So again, no matter which party wins in November, I think this will be a priority for the next administration. There has been progress over the last few years, but more needs to be done. Specifically, there are 4 areas where I believe we can and should do a better job. First, monitoring potential atrocities. Second, implementing preventative measures. Third, immediately responding to ongoing atrocities. And fourth, planning for potential accountability mechanisms. An obvious first step towards the prevention of genocide is the accurate and precise monitoring of areas where atrocities may potentially occur. In this regard, the United States has developed a fairly comprehensive monitoring system, given our current resources devoted to this issue. Policymakers receive in-depth and timely information on potential atrocities. A successful system of monitoring atrocities is dependent on officers in the field having a clear sense of the warning signs of potential atrocities and knowing what to report and when. I'll give you an example of why this is a problem. There was an exercise that was done last year with incoming Foreign Service officers at the Foreign Service Institute. It was a role-playing game. And they were given a number of different events, which they then had to prioritize and write it up into a cable that they were sending back to Washington. One of these items was that a militia group went into a refugee camp and killed 100 people of an opposing ethnic group. Out of the 25 entry-level officers doing this exercise, only 2 of them thought that worthy to report back to Washington. I don't know what else was on the test. I mean, they may have had nuclear bombs blowing up or something. So I don't want to be too hard. But it indicates that we need to do more in terms of training our diplomats, of training intelligence agents, of training aid and development specialists. We need to show them what the warning signs are. And we've been working on this over the last couple of years, trying to increase people's awareness of this, making it a part of classes at the Foreign Service Institute. In this process, there's also a major role for NGOs. And I don't want to limit that just to human rights organizations, but also relief groups and others that often maintain a larger and more geographically robust field presence than governments do in conflict zones. Their input of information strengthens the system of reporting and monitoring. I find this to be an invaluable tool. Since the time I've been in this job, I've met on a monthly basis with human rights and relief organizations, bringing them together in Washington most of the time, but in New York 2 or 3 times a year, and just having a frank discussion over a 2-hour period where we have a give and take. Officers from my office who work on various geographical regions come in and talk about what they're doing. And then we hear what the NGOs think. And again, a lot of times they do have a better sense of what's going on the ground and very good ideas on where we can direct our focus. They also help to give us ideas on policy proposals and policy formulation. The views that we advocate don't always prevail in the State Department. I mean, we are looking at it from a view that is often very close to what the NGOs are saying. But once it gets into a policy debate, there are a lot of other factors that influence what the final decision is going to be. But all in all, the U.S. government monitoring system has worked fairly well. Nevertheless, gaps remain. More can be done. In order to make use of the effort to track early warning signs, though, we must develop a system of tools to address problems that are identified at the earliest point possible. Policymakers must do a better job listening to their analysts and integrating prevention concerns into their general political calculus. This is one area in which I believe, despite some progress, the United States still lags. We have not adequately assembled a toolbox of responses to different warning signs. To provide a few examples, in advance of any specific incident, we could develop a range of strategies that could be pulled off the shelf to deal with cases that we believe might potentially lead to atrocities. Among these could be a press strategy to counter hate speech, the assignment of a team to strategize on how to engage local leaders diplomatically, or a strategy for diplomatic efforts to build international consensus for action before events spiral out of control. These are all things that the United States does presently when faced with potential impending incidents. However, our efforts to date have largely been reactive, ad hoc responses to specific crises. We have not looked at these tools through the lens of prevention and focused on developing best practices. The next area where I believe we can increase our ability to deal with atrocities is in the field of immediate response. Over and over again, post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction operations are organized in an ad hoc fashion. States, NGOs, or international organizations gather people with the requisite expertise to put together an appropriate response to an ongoing crisis. Sometimes this works well, often it does not. One recurring theme of this type of ad hoc arrangement, however, is their transient nature. I once had a discussion with Senator Biden, and I thought he gave the best description of this I've ever heard. He said, every time we go into a post-conflict or peacekeeping situation, we do it like it's the first time it's ever happened, and when we shut it down, we act as if it's never going to happen again. As a consequence, plans often focus on short-term political expediency at the expense of permanent solutions. Better advanced planning, having a concrete coordination mechanism in place to deploy the necessary personnel given the nature of the conflict, will help build in longer-term considerations to stabilization. One concrete example of this need for long-term planning, one that falls within this judicial area, regards securing evidence of atrocities. In the immediate aftermath of a conflict, there is often a short window when certain types of evidence are easily accessible that could later be useful in prosecutions. Oftentimes, obtaining that same information at a later date is difficult or impossible. It is therefore imperative that future post-conflict stabilization operations include in them individuals who are qualified and capable of preserving the evidence necessary to support ensuing accountability processes. During my time at ICTY, I personally participated in efforts of this sort in Bosnia and Croatia in 1995, in Kosovo in 1999, and then with the U.S. government in Iraq in 2003. In none of these instances were the resources adequate to deal with the scale of the problem we faced. During the Kosovo conflict, I managed ICTY operations in Albania, where we had a sizable team of investigators and lawyers, but nowhere near what was needed to deal with the crisis situation, as hundreds of thousands of refugees flooded across the border, many with pertinent information on crimes that we would later prosecute. When the war ended, I went into Kosovo with the first NATO troops on June 12, 1999. Within days, we were being inundated with reports of mass graves. Although we had done a lot of pre-planning and had arranged a multinational group of forensic teams, NATO did not have the resources to secure the grave sites, and we could not deploy the forensic teams quickly enough. Nor did we have ICTY resources to adequately prioritize mass grave sites or to secure incriminating documents or other evidence. Likewise in Iraq, after Saddam's fall, people who were free for the first time to go find their loved ones started digging up mass graves all over the country. Buildings with crucial records were looted, and so on. These, unfortunately, are not isolated incidents. Most interventions have been under-resourced and not adequately supported by military forces to deal with the issue of war crimes. Recently, the United States has begun to tackle this general problem through the creation of the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization in the State Department. I was very involved in the initiative to create this office during my time at the White House, and my interest in this issue stemmed directly from the experiences I've just recounted. The proposal that we put forward was to create sort of a U.S. government equivalent of the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations that could enhance U.S. participation in UN peacekeeping missions, in NATO missions, or in interventions by the U.S. and other interested states. Because of my direct experience, I felt strongly that the most robust component of a standing civilian response mechanism should be in the rule of law area, and recognizing that one of the most pressing concerns from the outset of any mission would be dealing with war crimes. While this office has experienced a rather bumpy start in the growing pains of any new organization fighting for turf, it has recently received a green light from Congress to set up a rapidly deployable post-conflict capacity that will be composed of on-call civilians. Among the slots envisioned in this initial tranche are several for transitional justice and other rule of law issues. In this way, pre-planning a post-conflict stabilization coordination mechanism can serve to ensure that issues critical to long-term stability, such as accountability, do not get pushed aside in favor of short-term expediency. The U.S. efforts to create this sort of capability have not gone on in isolation. A number of other governments, including the UK, Germany, and Canada, have undertaken similar initiatives over the last few years. The more governments that do this, the better. It is also vitally important that these types of undertakings not be limited just to North America and Europe. Having strong regional actors in Latin America, Asia, and particularly Africa will strengthen any framework that is created. The more robust framework there is for response, and the more diverse it is, the more it will benefit the UN, the ICC, and other international, hybrid, and domestic justice initiatives. And so that brings me to the last component of a genocide prevention response strategy, and that is in the area of accountability. It's often necessary to focus resources on post-conflict justice for years following a conflict. From our experience in the Balkans, in the Great Lakes region of Africa, in Cambodia, and elsewhere, it's clear that the full resolution of conflicts can take years beyond the conclusion of hostilities. These issues continue to permeate the entire political debate for years and years. Coupled with the fact that a prior case of violent conflict is one of the strongest indicators of risk for future conflict, it becomes increasingly apparent that long-term follow-through in dealing with past conflicts is itself a tool of genocide prevention. One key element of this approach is the establishment of judicial or non-judicial mechanisms for dealing with those who may have committed atrocities. This is an essential tool for genocide prevention because it contributes to the overall stability of a post-conflict society. It decreases the likelihood that small incidents will escalate into broader patterns of violence, and it creates, I believe, a smaller deterrent effect. If done successfully, it imbues in the local community a sense of confidence that the judiciary, i.e. nonviolent means, can set things right and can mete out justice without resort to retaliation and settling scores. Firmly setting the precedent that people are held to account for atrocities they have committed is a valuable tool to have when invariably something goes wrong in the process of stabilization. To a lesser extent, but certainly not an insignificant one, I'm convinced that prosecuting war criminals deters potential perpetrators. I know this runs counter to what Mark said this morning, and I agree with him. It's difficult for practical reasons to cite specific cases of individuals who were deterred from committing crimes. But it is relatively simple to point out some instances in which a strong record of accountability might have had a partial deterrent effect. I always come back to the quote of Adolf Hitler before he launched the Holocaust. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? So accountability remains critical, and finding the right approach to accountability mechanisms has to be a priority for the next administration. The approach the U.S. has settled on in recent years tracks very closely with the ICC approach of complementarity. Our first preference would be for domestic institutions to deal with crimes committed in a given situation, recognizing, though, that in many post-conflict scenarios, it will be impossible for reasons of lack of political will, inadequate capacity, or ethnic bias to rely on domestic capabilities. We then would turn to some sort of mixed international domestic process. This could take the form of a hybrid court, like the Special Court for Sierra Leone or the Extraordinary Chambers of Cambodia, or of inserting international judges and prosecutors into an existing system, like was done in Kosovo, or by providing technical and financial support to a domestic court, as was done in Iraq. Obviously, we have to keep trying to improve on these models. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from the courts that have gone so far. But what we do need to do is try to develop a successful template that can be used in the future. Obviously, there's no one-size-fits-all solution for this. Every conflict, every country is different. So we are going to have to mold it as the situation requires. But nevertheless, there are going to be some lowest common denominators that we could agree on that would help with the functioning of these courts. The final option is a fully international process, which now would presumably be with the ICC. I can't imagine any new fully international ad hoc tribunals being created. Although a new administration may emphasize one of these areas more than others, I feel certain that this same general approach will be pursued. Right now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the U.S. contributes close to $100 million a year into transitional justice processes through the various tribunals and a number of domestic initiatives. It is critical that we continue to maintain this level of support, and I'm sure that will be the case with the next administration. We need to do everything we can to bolster these mechanisms, whether we're talking about viable options for accountability or tools for prevention and response. In so doing, we can continue moving in the direction of a robust framework for preventing and addressing genocide. Having all of these tools available makes it much easier for a government to respond to genocide. At the end of the day, though, no matter how solid a structure we create, the effectiveness of our efforts will ultimately be determined by the exercise of political will, a point made so eloquently by Bob Kruger last night and by Omar Ishmael this morning. It requires the will to speak out and call a genocide what it is, the will to use the diplomatic and, in some instances, military capabilities necessary to address it, and the will to throw the government's full support behind efforts to ensure accountability for perpetrators. The legacy that we inherited from Nuremberg to the work that is done every day in these tribunals, this continuum of confronting genocide puts incredible pressure on political figures to act. It makes it more and more difficult for anyone to credibly say that they don't know these sorts of things are happening. So as we stand here today, I think we can look back with some satisfaction on what has been achieved over the last 15 years. But all of us who are here, whether we are prosecutors, academics, NGO representatives, or diplomats, need to continue pushing this concept of accountability. Too often we've heard people say, never again. But time and time again, we have seen that these are empty words. If it is going to change, it will be because of the work that all of us here are doing. Thank you. All right, now I'm on the hot seat, so happy to start trying to take some questions.
Yeah, my concern is that by our actions, sometimes it seems that we say we believe in international law, but it doesn't apply to us. Jackson said at Nuremberg, as we pass a poison chalice to the lips of these defendants, we pass it to our lips as well. That's an indication that we want it applied to us. We don't join the International Criminal Court for sovereignty reasons. And the Genocide Convention, we passed amendments which destroy its effectiveness in a realistic sense. We have what's going on in Guantanamo, which is violation of international law, and failure to comply with the Geneva Conventions. Now, we have to change something here, and you're working on that. I appreciated your information that you give us, but do you have any thoughts on how we can change this situation where we are engaged in a bit of hypocrisy?
I agree with you completely. I think that our actions over the last 6, 7 years have had a terrible impact on our credibility. I mean, as someone who is carrying this message, going around, meeting with other governments, meeting with people, I hear this all the time. And my response is always to say, there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. You know, there are a lot of things that have happened that have impacted our ability to be an effective actor on these issues. I would put it in context, though. I think that you talk about crimes that have occurred in Iraq, for example, and you talk about, you know, what happened at Abu Ghraib. We do, despite the problems that have come about, have a robust military and civilian justice system that is dealing with these issues. Over 100 soldiers have been prosecuted for crimes in Iraq, including some that are facing the death penalty now. One who is a former soldier who's being prosecuted in civilian court for this horrible rape and murder of a 14-year-old girl and her family. You had prosecutions for Abu Ghraib. You've had congressional inquiries into these things. We have a media that actively pursues these things. Despite the problems we've had, we have a robust system that is responding. Maybe it's taken longer than people would like. I mean, certainly in the situation of Guantanamo, I think the courts gave the administration incredible deference for a long period of time. But at a certain point, decided they needed to be much more interventionist, and we've seen that over the last year. So I think things have started to balance out in a lot of ways. And when you go back to these crimes that have occurred, you know, again, talking about like these killings in Haditha or Abu Ghraib, these have come forward because American soldiers have reported them. They have reported their fellow soldiers for committing the crimes. So our system can work. But you're right, we've taken a black eye. It's something that the next administration is going to have to do a lot to repair damage there. I think even within this administration, there was a recognition, particularly in the second term, that more needed to be done to address a lot of these things. We've made a concerted effort, particularly in relation to the ICC. I've spent a lot of time working on this. And I think that things are on a positive trend. So when I'm saying with a new administration coming in, they're not going to change policies drastically, I'm talking within this specific area. But there are certainly questions that pertain to our broader credibility, which will have to be addressed. And I think you will see major changes there.
Mr. Ahmed, somehow I missed the idea or just don't get it yet. Could you tell us just basically on what authority does any group to assume jurisdiction or set up a court or whatever with jurisdiction over what a sovereign country and a sovereign set of officials does or fails to do? Do I make myself confused?
I think I understand what you're asking. Well, I mean, this was the position largely taken by the United States in relation to the International Criminal Court, that this was a treaty-based court whose jurisdiction was exercised because of people becoming signatories to the treaty. In other words, voluntarily submitting themselves to the jurisdiction of that court, or in situations where referrals were made through the Security Council, which under the UN Charter is the guarantor of peace and security and has certain enforcement authorities. But this has been the U.S. position. I'm sure everybody doesn't agree with that, but that's the approach taken. There is certainly a move, I think, and a lot of the genesis behind the International Criminal Court was to provide an institution that could exercise jurisdiction to ensure that nobody escaped with impunity. But we haven't quite gotten there yet. But this is always going to be an issue, is this question of surrendering or decreasing the degree of sovereignty to allow an international institution to exercise its authority. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Yeah, well,
Well, I mean, in relation to the ICC, nations have voluntarily joined the court. So this is not a situation where it has imposed its authority on states against their will. In other cases, I mean, you have situations where the Security Council has exercised this authority. There's some resentment of countries where this has happened. I mean, certainly in Darfur, in Sudan, I mean, the fact that the Security Council referred this case to the ICC and empowered it to investigate a state that is not a party to the court, I mean, that's an issue. But I mean, it's not something that I can resolve. This is, I think, one of the big points of contention in international justice.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Yes.
You addressed what we should do prior to genocide occurring, and you addressed what we should do after. But one of the problems that we have in using Darfur as an example is we have an ongoing genocide, and we have leadership that's being supported by China. And we have a situation where they don't have to worry about doing this with impunity right now because China's supporting them, and so they can continue doing what they're doing because no one wants to rock the boat with China. What would you propose that we do in an ongoing genocide? Because before we're guessing whether it's going to happen, after, well, the people are already dead, but during, once we see that it's actually occurring, that's really the crux of the issue.
Well, I think there are a number of things that can be done. I just mentioned it in passing, but you're right, I didn't go into great detail about it. But there ideally are a number of diplomatic initiatives that can be undertaken, things such as sanctions, trying to increase international pressure, putting visa restrictions on officials, these sort of non-military acts. There's also the possibility of military intervention, as was done in the case of Kosovo. It has been incredibly difficult to get a consensus for what could be done in Darfur. I mean, one of the things that this administration did try to do on Darfur is try to line up neighboring states, trying to line up people on the African continent to take ownership of this issue, to at least be supportive of a more activist response. And that's been difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. As we heard this morning, the African Union, the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Countries have all been very critical of the ICC indictment. And we've seen a lot of backing away from this, even among our European colleagues now, thus putting us in the strange position of being more supportive than they were of what the ICC is doing. But there is no easy answer. I mean, it's a constant tension that we experience on issues just every day. I mentioned this in passing, that our views don't always prevail. But there's so many actors in the policy process within every government advocating different things. We are generally advocating, my office and myself, advocating from the position of accountability and international justice. We may come to not blows, but knock heads with our colleagues in a regional bureau who are looking at what is the thing that we do that's politically expedient. You know, what decision do we take right now to achieve a short-term peace, or they may say just peace, period. It goes back to that issue of peace versus justice. From my perspective, the ideal way to resolve the issue with the LRA and Kony is to see Kony arrested and go to the ICC. Now, you know, others in my government may feel differently about that. But you get into this same sort of policy debate every time you start talking about what options you can deploy. And the Clinton administration was hamstrung all the way through his first term, or almost to the end of his first term, on what to do in Bosnia. He was very critical of President Bush 41 about not being active enough in dealing with the situation in Bosnia. They got into office. They encountered difficulties within the administration. From the military side, they encountered it from foreign actors. So achieving that kind of consensus is very difficult. But ultimately, I think it comes down to the political will that has to be exercised from the very top. There are always going to be these institutional equities that are fighting it out at lower levels. in order to overcome that, you need someone at the very highest level who's willing to say, this is what I want to do, and I am determined to force this through. That's the only way it's going to happen. I mean, if I'm going, you know, battling this out with other assistant secretaries, we're all the same rank, you know, it's going to end up in deadlock. And a lot of times, policy just sort of dies right there. So it's, you know, I'm not discounting how difficult it is to mount a response. I mean, particularly when you're talking about doing a military response. But it's, I think you have to look at the whole range of options that are available and try to find the most effective way, you know, in any given situation. But there's no easy answer on it.
What if given
We're going to pause for a second here, because I know he's got to make a flight, and if you want to continue a little bit, but I just want to say to the ambassador, thank you so much, because he's got to catch a flight back to Washington.
15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Yeah, so, whatever you need to give everybody out.
We're going to give you 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Okay, so, all right, maybe one other, sorry, just if there's, or if that's it, okay.
Well, the only thing I was going to follow that up with is, given the desire for international credibility, what about, if not direct support, at least not opposition, to creating a police force within the ICC so that where a state has already given consent to jurisdiction, the police force can actually make it a more effective unit? I mean, they can't arrest anyone. They can't get these people that they have indictments out to come to court. This would give them a means of exercising some authority.
But I mean, how are you going to get that into Sudan? The only way you're going to insert a police force to effect arrest in Khartoum of a minister in the Sudanese government is with a massive military operation backing up that police force. I mean, they're not operating in a domestic law enforcement environment. So you're still going to require this huge insertion of military force to support anything like that.
Certainly, but you're also going to have, if you have a police force, and that force is blocked either militarily or otherwise, then you're internationally in a position where you may get an international response.
I'm not sure I understand, but yeah, so, yeah. Okay.
Well, then you can move on to other
Okay, so.
With that, I'd like to say thank you very much for the insight, the candor. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.